Hi, everyone. I should have also asked how many people were in the previous talk I just gave on coaching novices. There's a few commonalities there. What we're really looking at here is sort of the next phase, moving beyond the novice year, although some of this is relevant to kids late in their novice year, and some of this is quite relevant to varsity athletes who maybe didn't have quite the same ideal experience in their third year. So, a lot of this is just sort of understanding where the athlete is at. To say no more, I'm going to start diving in here. So the overview is we're going to look at the challenges that are presented to the second year rower. We're going to talk about some principles, guiding principles, and our first steps. We're going to talk a little bit about teaching, technique, training, culture building, and motivation and assessment. And I got to get this to progress. Here we go. So what are some of the challenges of the second year rower? Well, if you're on a big team, a lot of times they come out of being in a relatively happy novice experience, and suddenly they're in like the nth boat. Like I remember there was one season where we had 7 varsity 8s when I was at community rowing, which is just a god awful number. And my heart just would go out to these kids that are in the 5th, 6th, 7th boat. Like what you kind of what is that emotionally feel like to those kids? And sometimes the hardest part about that is that they just feel hopeless when they get to race day, because they know they're going to lose to the other boat, from their own club if they're a B entry or a C entry. And I always appreciated when Chase would actually have races in the fall for, third boats, fourth boats, etc. Because a lot of the races that we would go to, everyone would have to be in the same junior 8 if they're in a head race. So. And the danger here is that if they feel like they're way behind the best athletes on the team, they feel like they're a different species, and they begin to feel the pain of comparison to a large group is actually really amotivating. But a lot of what we're going to be talking about throughout this talk is understanding kind of the motivational space that the athlete is in, and how do we create a situation that enables them to transition from this really challenging place that they're in to blossoming as a varsity athlete at some point down the line. So if you're on a small team, it can be very different, but it can be equally challenging. So a lot of times you get these novices, and I, when I coached at community rowing, we started as a very small team, and it grew into being the largest team in the country at one point. And I don't know quite how their size is now, but like at various times in the 20 plus years I was there, we had both very, very small teams and very, very big ones. And currently I'm coaching a small team again, D3 collegiate women. I've coached a number of other big teams as well. So, sometimes you see this kid who's like the star right out of novice, and they get thrown into the top boat. They have no idea how it is they're supposed to behave. Like they have a tremendous amount of imposter syndrome going on, because there's so much that they don't know, and we have to try and remember that as coaches. So they tend to feel very self-conscious about making technical errors, but then you also have to be careful when they can then feel really superior to the other kids when those older kids leave, and now they're sort of the remaining kid, and they've been on the varsity boat for a long time. And so, we need to sort of address that from an early moment to make sure that that doesn't end up being a problem. They also can be, if they're in a boat with more experienced athletes, sometimes they get scapegoated, where athletes, blame them disproportionately for problems. And they can feel very socially isolated when there are differences in the age group between, say, sophomores and seniors, especially because the seniors and juniors tend to be really focused on, college. And that causes a lot of stress and strife. And a lot of times the younger kids shouldn't have to worry about that too much. One of the things I always loved about coaching at development camp was that it's an age group, those kids right after their sophomore year, it's an age group of kids for which it's all still fun, and it doesn't have that that like, oh my God, crushing stress of like what's going on with college, quite as in their face as it becomes later. And any team, there's this, these are some of the challenges that can have if they feel like they're stuck with underperforming slackers and they learn a bad attitude, or they might get trained as if they're way more developed than they actually are. I think there are a whole bunch of pitfalls here that we could spend some time. So one of the guiding principles we're going to talk about is this idea of curriculum mapping, which is simply identifying like everything that you want the athlete to know by the time they graduate and move on from your program. You've got to account for where and when that's going to happen and who's going to teach it to them. So I think it's a really important thing to do between head coaches, varsity coaches, JV coaches, or sometimes you may be coaching more than one of those groups. Everyone needs to have the same idea as sort of what are they learning at these different phases, and when is what covered. I mean, just as an example, I think nutrition is incredibly important. Rules of rowing are really important for the athletes, especially the coxswains, to know, well, when are they going to learn this stuff? Because probably on race day is not the time to go over the rules of rowing. So, making sure that in your planning, you're actually making sure that all these things are accounted for. Understanding that progression proactively is going to really help, I think, to make sure that you're all on the same page. So putting it all in, having that kind of meeting time I think is really valuable across the staff. So when we think about sort of year 2, what goes in our bucket, right? I think it's incredibly important to assume that you're going to address the fundamentals of technique as a part of review from the very beginning. And maybe that goes without saying, but I do think that sometimes that gets sort of skipped over a little bit. And I actually do this even with the most experienced varsity athletes. In fact, to be honest, like I start novices and I start the development camp kids with going over grip and where the contact points are. That'll come up in a later slide. But I can tell you that I did the exact same thing working with the U23 scullers when I was helping as a technical consultant for the U23 lightweight men's quad camp. And it was tremendously valuable. So never underestimate the power and importance of reviewing fundamentals. We need to think about including in our bucket, because I guarantee even if it was talked about as novices, they won't remember it, understanding how to train. If you're around for my 3rd session, when we talk about athlete-centered coaching, one of the things that is really important to building agency is that the athletes need to have an understanding of why they do what they're doing. And so giving them information, not just having them do workouts, but let them understand, why are you doing the workouts that you're doing? And so teaching them how to train, I think, is an incredibly important part of this 2nd year. It's also developmentally appropriate in terms of the long-term athlete development stuff, which again, we'll talk about in a minute. And I think the other thing that is incredibly important at this moment is getting them to have an understanding of what does it really mean to be a member of this team, and what is the role on the team. So understanding a little bit about the nature of human behavior and human motivation, like people want to be a part of something and they want being a part of that something to have meaning. And so their ability to maybe weather some of the problems and stresses that they're going to have on the water is definitely mitigated if they start to develop this self-concept of being part of this group and understanding of why they have pride in being a member of that team. And this is stuff that you really want to take the time to be proactive about engaging them in, because this is going to have a lot to do with changing their motivational structures from the appropriate novice, which is about having fun and meeting people, to moving them towards a fully integrated set of extrinsic motivation that a high-level experienced athlete is going to have, but that's going to take time to develop. And so this is a really foundational step, is getting the kid to understand, like, what are the elements of pride in your team? What does it mean to be a member of this team? So, and this gets back to the situational leadership model. If you were in the earlier session, understanding, that novices are starting out here where they have very low competency, but high motivation because it's new, it's fun. And as we move into the second year, we're really looking at this top right quadrant here where they still have low competency, and they actually tend to, according to virtually all studies of this kind of stuff, actually have a lower level of motivation. And my wife was a very successful intercollegiate swimmer, and she was like, yeah, my hardest year was my sophomore year. It's a very mentally challenging time, whether you're talking about high school athletes, collegiate athletes. This phase is always the hardest phase. And I can tell you, having spent a long time coaching a community rowing where you're dealing with adults who come through Learn to Row, they have a tremendous amount of fun in Learn to Row. They might go into the next class, that might start to be fun. But the big loss always in groups is between those initial stages and then people who stick with it to become members of a competitive masters team or do whatever there. And it's all because of this really predictable set of understanding where their situation is and tying it into this kind of situational leadership model. So if we're in the second group, we need to understand that the athlete has some skills. They're developing this idea of self-guidance. They're ready for some new challenges, but it's really important that we're building their intrinsic motivation and reformulating what their goals are. We need to have a little bit of more direct instruction still, because they don't necessarily have the skills for some of the other types of instruction that we would get into with more experienced athletes. But we do want to start to think a little bit about other types of learning besides direct instruction. So the other principle I want to make sure that we're always in touch with is the idea of long-term athlete development, and understand that these kids are still growing, sometimes maybe not externally, maybe just internally, and growth can actually impede technical performance. In other words, a lot of times what you'll see is really awkward motion out of sophomores, particularly out of the sophomore girls. And a lot of that has to do with what's going on with their growth at those moments. Flexibility is really important to training at this point, particularly with the boys. As they grow, they tend to become very challenged in terms of their flexibility. So these are sensitive periods in terms of their hormonal changes and what's going on physiologically. And so you can get a lot of training out of speed training, stamina, endurance, that kind of stuff, and some strength. Boys, really we're looking at sort of speed training, stamina, but not a lot of max strength until they're 16 to 17, because they really need to be 12 to 18 months after their peak height velocity to be fully ready to train in that. So I think it's also really important to understand at this point in terms of long-term athlete development that they have to learn the mental and physical challenges of competition. We often kind of forget that they don't know where their heads should be when they're actually racing. And so kudos to you if you've done a fair amount of preparing them for this, but like they need to actually understand where to put competition in their head. And I think that competition can be really valuable when it's used to develop the kind of strategic and tactical understanding. But the outcome has to be in like, how do we race? What do we learn from racing? Not just did you win or lose? And let's not be those coaches that get overly caught up in outcomes. I'm a big believer in the John Wooden philosophy that winning is not the goal. Winning is something that happens a lot if you set the right goals. So trying to make sure that every time they're entering competition with a whole set of what it is they're trying to accomplish in that competition that have nothing to do with the outcome. Because those those elements, if they are achieved, are going to lead you to the outcomes that you want to have in the long run. So we'll talk about teaching, technique, training, culture building, and motivation and assessment. So jumping right in on the teaching part, the most important thing we can do at this phase is to create a mastery climate. And what is a mastery climate? It's a situation where we're really focused on the acquisition of new skills. It's a climate that's really cooperative. So I talked a little bit about this idea of getting more experienced athletes to help coach each other, but you can even get their peers to help each other. And this is where I think the smartphone is such a handy tool. You can have them, film each other and show it to each other, and pair kids up on the erg or something like that, just to get them used to this idea that they're all in it together and that they're all helping each other out. I think it's important to be really focused on this idea of self-development, like that every individual is going to be making improvements at their own rate, that you're recognizing and championing hard work as opposed to who's actually fast. You need to track progress and measure it and celebrate it. And I think it's really important that all athletes are valued. Again, we're still at a phase where a lot of times the slower, less effective kids at this age are actually going to be more effective kids a couple years down the line. Because so much of performance at these early stages, when we're dealing with high school athletes, is determined by whether they matured early, but actually the late maturers frequently are going to have more long-term potential. So I thought this was a really interesting little quote on a mastery climate. A mastery climate, and this comes from a website that I found. I like to always do a little research on sort of what's out there as well. A mastery climate is one in which personal accomplishment is emphasized through the way practice is structured. Right? So it goes right into how you're structuring your practices. Athletes are encouraged to develop a self-referenced perception of success, where the success is measured by their personal accomplishments rather than comparing themselves to their peers. And that's a really important thing for us to ponder. Each athlete works at his or her own level, accomplishing tasks and reaching goals that are unique to his or her own situation. And the research is clear about the benefits of this type of environment. In fact, actually, just as an aside, there was a really interesting work done at the University of Otago that showed that with on elite level, Olympic level athletes for the New Zealand Olympic team, that actually it seems that the most effective training environment for Olympic level athletes, forget about high school sophomores, for Olympic level athletes is 2/3 mastery climate, 1/3 competition. So understand that these fundamentals are super, super important. Moving on a little bit, a performance climate, also called a competitive or ego climate, can lead to a lot of negative stress. It can lead to decreased intrinsic motivation, and it can lead to performance anxiety. And these kids are dealing with a lot of anxiety. So part of why this motivational climate piece is really important. It's just understanding what's the impact going to be on the emotional well-being of the athlete. I thought this is an interesting little acronym about this motivational climate piece. Is target. It's task, so we're looking at creating challenging tasks. Authority, we want to allow the athletes to be involved in making some decisions. I think this is a really important time to start building that sense of agency. Recognition, and this is, I think, not necessarily intuitive. It's really important at this stage with these kind of level of maturity of these athletes that you're dealing with, that a lot of times it's more effective for you to recognize accomplishments in private rather than in front of the group, because you actually want to minimize the social comparisons within the group. Okay, so if you're recognizing the same people all the time in practice, you're going to demotivate. You're going to have it's going to be not a very productive situation for the kids that you're not essentially recognizing in the group. It's also incredibly effective at this point in their what they're doing to have the groups grouped heterogeneously. In other words, to have mixed boats. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean you want to have your like worst JV kids with your best varsity kids, but even if you just have the opportunity within sort of the, maybe a two-boat group. One of my first coaching jobs was at the Buckingham Brown and Nichols School, and I had the essentially the sophomore girls, and I had 2 4s. And so within that circumstance, spending a lot of time having those 2 4s relatively even and mixed would have been the right thing to do. It's not what I did at the time. This was a very long time ago, 30 years ago. But it actually would have been, I would have been better served waiting to create the top boat than doing it too early, particularly with this kind of group. I'm not going to make that the argument that's the same thing necessarily at the top level of a large team, but if you have, but even then, its value, it has a tremendous amount of value. Valuation needs to be based on individual successes and achievements, not a lot of social comparison. I think I talked a little later on about how motivating it is to be when you have a big group. Timing is important. Not all athletes learn at the same pace, and you want to allow for adequate time for the least skilled. So be really thoughtful and judicious about making sure you're bringing everybody along. So a little bit about teaching. I think I always conceive of teaching rowing as a spiral staircase, that we're sort of going around over the same things, but hopefully coming back at a higher level each time we touch on it. So I'm going to start with the same principles, regardless of the level. I'm going to start with really simple things. But if you can start to assess what the athletes know, then you might move a little quicker and introduce new and more challenging elements of the concept. And I think one way to actually do a really good job of figuring out where the athletes are is every time I introduce something new to a group of non-novices, I'm like, so what do we know about this? What would you say is important about whatever that element may be? The recovery, drive timing, suspension, connection, any number of different things. And whatever it is, start the conversation not by you explicating, but by querying where they're at. And then you can focus on what you're doing to try to work off of where you see their gaps. So you have to cover everything, but you can tend to do it a lot quicker than the first time around. Again, the importance of peer teaching is that it helps establish a positive team dynamic. It helps build leadership within the group. You want to start thinking within this group, like who are going to be your future leaders. Interactive relationship leads to what's called the zone of proximal development. So this transitional scaffold until the knowledge is fully internalized. So and the athlete gains a lot of confidence from the partnership until they actually have a sense of their own independence. So the interaction between teammates builds that kind of mastery and goal-oriented dynamic. And you're facilitating this positive controlled peer interaction. And it helps build confidence and understanding within the individual. So it's a tremendously powerful educational tool. This is also, it's a really good time to sort of get them to elucidate what they know, to talk about it through peer teaching. And so you can sort of test where their knowledge is. I think the key is that you're moderating these things so that you're sort of really aware that everybody is getting to the same level by the end of your session. So I like to start with sort of a group brainstorming, like the whole group sitting there and saying, okay, like what's important about this? What's important about whatever the topic may be? What is important about the catch? Peer modeling is really important in this age group. So when you're dealing with adolescents, they will get more out of seeing their peers do it than by seeing a video of the national team doing a skill. Not to say there's not value in that. And sometimes that's the best way to show something that, show really high level rowing. But for this age group, it's incredibly important when you can show them video of maybe the previous year's varsity boats from your own squad, kids that they know. It makes it seem, it's a level of ignition that goes off within the athlete's head that it makes it seem way more possible. So this is part of this is understanding the adolescent mind and understanding sort of where they're coming from. You want them to think, oh, if I just work harder, I can become the thing that I want to become. And so when you show video and it's too removed, they are less engaged and they internalize it less. When you show video of people that they know, and like this is them doing this drill, right? Then it becomes way more meaningful to them. And there's a lot of research that backs this up. Slow motion and real time are both effective. Slow motion video is more useful for beginners than showing it at speed. Showing it at speed is appropriate for later stages of development. And it's a good idea for you to cue key points. I think it's a really helpful thing sometimes to start off by showing them some video and say, like, what do you see? What do you think? What do you notice about this? And then go back in and start to cue them, because you are trying to build their engagement and building them to be more students of the sport. So getting them to actually spend some time thinking about, like, doing the analysis themselves is part of building that that engagement. So like I said, I'll try and get to most of these questions, the questions that people put in a little later on in the session. So I do want to try and get through a lot of this stuff first, but I don't want to lose track of your questions in the long run. So, all right. When you are setting up this kind of peer stuff with small groups, I think it's also really important that you do set ground rules ahead of time. Give them some idea of what appropriate feedback is, just to keep it positive. So, and I really like getting them to use their phones. So now let's talk, probably some of you have heard about this, this idea of deliberate practice. Understand that deliberate practice is really mentally hard, but deliberate practice, which is when the fastest learning is going to happen, happens when you are at this level that is just shy of frustration. So it can't be routine and boring and easy. And I feel like a lot of rowing and a lot of coaches spend a lot of time doing things at this level of relatively routine. And you will learn through repetition if you do that enough times, but it's slow learning. And the faster learning is at this level that is actually much more challenging. And this is why I'm a big fan of small boats, for example, because just learning how to row in a pair, like, really sets them up. So with this kind of group of second-year rowers, putting them more in small boats is a tremendously valuable thing to do, because it's mastery focused, it's high challenge level, it is occasionally frustrating, but frustration is a reaction in their mind. And so setting them up to respond to moments of failure positively as learning from your mistakes, creating an environment where it's safe to fail, is really important, particularly for this age group, for this developmental group. Games and competitions can lead to focus. As I said in the earlier presentation, like, one of my favorite things to do is to give them like a challenge where you have two boats and you say, okay, from here to, whatever bridge, you're going to do a pause. You're going to do 5 strokes and then pause and try and pause the blades off the water. Now, if you can get to the next catch without the blade ever hitting the water, so then you get to add a second stroke on a pause. So you add a pause each time. And so they don't get to add a pause unless it's totally clean and the boat stays balanced. So then they keep adding, and whichever boat has added the most, they get a little moment of like, woohoo. And the point is that their focus on actually keeping the boat balanced is way harder the moment you set it up as a competition and a little game than if you just told them to do 5 and pause and try and balance the boat all the time. So the other thing that's really important about teaching here is to understand how big your chunks need to be. So it's a mistake to have a day that's like, okay, today's going to be your technique day. It's much more valuable if you are going to do a good chunk of technical work. It's much more valuable to intersperse it throughout the course of the practice. So don't think about, I'm just going to do a bunch of drills, then we're going to do the workout, then we're going to do cool down, and then we're going to go home. Like, better to intersperse the technical moments as part of your rest interval. Like, spread it out throughout the course of the practice. The mental energy for them to try and be learning new technique is in and of itself fatiguing of what's going on neurologically. And so you want to have them have relatively shorter chunks distributed, where in between they don't have to think as hard. All right, so I think another important thing to understand is these ideas of what's called random and block modeling. So block modeling is repetition of a single discrete skill, and that's pretty good for early skill acquisition. Random modeling is highly variable challenges. In the long run, it's going to lead to greater retention. It's going to have greater transfer to performance. And let's just talk about a really simple example. Like one example that is classic when they talk about the science behind this is, say, the difference between practicing free throws from just the free throw line and just doing a whole bunch of those to the idea of moving around and practicing shots from lots of different places. It will take them longer to gain acquisition if you move it around, but their gains will be more durable, and in the long run, the gains will be more powerful. So how might this pertain to rowing? Well, just having, we're just going to work on the catch and not work on anything else for a long period of time. That would be block modeling of a single discrete skill. The idea that you say, okay, we're going to do a little bit of work on the front end. Now we're going to do some work on the back end. Now we're going to do this other drill. That's actually going to have not necessarily as much progress at the end of that day or even the end of that week, but it's going to have way more progress at the end of the season if you stick with it and understand this idea of like, okay, we're going to keep trying to change a little bit what they're thinking about and not have it just be really simple. So with novices, more block modeling. As you transition to this second year group, start to mix it up more. Don't have it be just as singular focused. Implicit versus explicit learning, I think, is also really important. So explicit is what we do as coaches all the time. We're trying to teach them to do this thing or that happen. Implicit learning is what happens when you put a kid in a tubby single and tell them to go figure it out. There's a lot of value to implicit learning, and there's particularly a lot of value to implicit learning at this stage. So now they have a little bit of knowledge. They have just enough knowledge and information that they can start to engage a little bit. And what happens when you put these kids with this level of understanding in a boat next to you and you're talking? They want you to give them feedback. What happens when you put them out in a tubby single with some supervision, of course, to make sure it's a safe circumstance, but essentially give them way more freedom? Now their focus and attention is not on whether the coach is telling them that they're doing it right. Now their focus and attention is actually on what's happening, what it feels like, and what the boat is telling them. At the end of the day, the boat is the best coach they'll ever be. It's always right, and it's always giving them feedback. The hard thing is, can they learn how to understand what the boat is telling them? So that's where the power of implicit learning comes in. And so giving them these opportunities where they can, I like to coach it in terms of small boat fun. I like to try and give the athletes a chance. All right, go out, have some freedom, take away the pressure of like just being observed and how they're performing and all that kind of stuff, and let them play around with it. So, a little more about technique. Still important to be in touch with coaching the body a little bit, but increasing the amount of focus on coaching the the blade and maybe start to think about coaching the boat. So when you start to see it, when you see an athlete make a change, like tell them, all right, so how does the boat move differently? Like cue their understanding and focus away from just what they're doing to start to understand how what they're doing impacts what they're feeling in terms of the boat. It's an incredibly powerful thing because it starts to change a little bit how they perceive. And what we want to do is build their kinesthetic awareness and their boat feel. All right, let's talk about externally focused feedback. Externally focused feedback is really important to expert motion. So as the athlete is transitioning away from their status as novice and having an expert, the idea of being able to actually execute without too much thought process, the externally focused feedback is going to enable them to essentially move more fluidly and not get caught up rowing. What is externally focused feedback? It says, rather than, get your legs down faster, it says, move the handle faster. It could be push more off the footboards. What it's not is getting them to think about their own body. So if you think about the idea of, create more run between strokes, that's externally focused feedback. If you tell them to push harder with the legs, that's going to tend to cause them to tense more muscles. So let's actually take a step back. In any person learning a new movement pattern, what happens at first is that the brain sends a relatively broad but relatively weak signal to not just the muscles that are going to be needed, but a bunch of muscles that are sort of close to it, because it doesn't know how to target yet the actual more precise movement pattern. And as you get more accomplished and more comfortable in whatever movement pattern that is through repetition, what happens is the brain starts to send a stronger and more focused signal to those muscles, which then results in a more powerful motion. So we get less tension, so less oppositional muscles working against each other, and we get more out of the muscles that we should be using. So when you start to give them too much internally focused feedback, they tend to go back to that sort of broader, less powerful, more interference type movement pattern. And so if you think about it as, don't tell them to use this muscle or that muscle more, tell them to get the better result. Well, as we start to deal with a higher level of skill, more externally focused feedback is going to be more effective. At a beginning level of skill, or to really optimize a change, you might need to get to that level of we need to use this muscle instead. I do think that this is a point where if they've mislearned stuff as novices, you're frequently better off trying to get across the idea of what the change is on land, maybe in the weight room, rather than trying to do too much internal focus on the water. Again, really trying to build that awareness of what the effect of what they're doing is on the boat. So when so-and-so changed this, did you feel the effect on the boat? Build the awareness of how other people are making changes. When 5 seat changed this, how did that feel different to you? Ask the bow seat, right? It's really important for them to begin to build that sense of what is happening. It's super important for the coxswains as well. All right. So my progression on technique, always start with contact points. Now we're going to go at a little bit higher level than the first time round, move to posture and body positions. A lot of this sport is putting the body in positions of strength. I'm amazed looking at, for years dealing with rowers at this point, like how many of them don't actually have an understanding of what a strong position at the catch actually is. So you put them in a weak position, they're going to use weak muscles, they're not going to be very effective. Then I always think it's important to understand the release if they can't get out properly and cleanly. If they're doing an okay job, then maybe you can skip over this a little bit, but a lot of problems get caught up right at this moment of the release. And it's almost impossible to have a good recovery sequence if you don't have a fundamentally good release. But also at this level of experience, most of the problems that I see at the catch or at the drive are happening because they don't have good recovery sequencing. So, or maybe even before that, because they don't have a good grip. So there are all these elements in which if you don't have the sort of prerequisites, you're not going to be able to do a good job of it. And just as a really simple one, if the body is moving still as you come into the catch, you're not going to have an effective drive. And so the idea of getting them to the point where they can have that body preparation accomplished and have a quiet body moving into the catch enables them to have a catch. And so even if they can catch well doing a placement drill, but then you go out and you start rowing along and they go back to poor recovery sequencing, suddenly they're not executing at the catch. The problem is not at the catch. The problem is at the release and the early stages of the recovery. So one of the things I think it's really important if you haven't been coaching for all that long is just understanding how important it is for you to be thinking at least half a stroke ahead of time. When you see a problem, when you see a persistent problem, a lot of time it's because not where what you see is happening, that's not where the problem is. The problem is half a stroke beforehand. And what does the athlete need to be doing differently to enable them to be successful? Because you can tell them 6 ways to Sunday, they need to get their blade in better. But if the problem is actually happening at the other end of the stroke, and you don't get them to fix that, they're never going to make the change you want to see. And so there's my progression. You can take a look at it later. If you want to ask me questions about it, you can certainly do so. So when we're teaching this technique, it's important that we're sort of breaking down the complex motions, scaffolding, and then putting it back together. But it's also really important that we're doing so in adding speed. So the point of any drill, the point of anything like this has got to be to connect something, give them a feeling, and then have them take that feeling and hold on to some element of that feeling as you get closer and closer to the way we want to actually execute on race day. So great, they can do it. Can they do it with a less stable platform? Great, they can do it. Can they do it faster? Great, can they do it and add a little more press? So you're always trying to sort of go back to good execution, but you're then gradually moving them to the point, eventually the point of failure, so that you're saying, okay, all right, that was a little, that wasn't as good. Let's slow it down again, see if we can get it right. Okay, now let's try it again a little faster. Or, and giving them that feedback. But, and so it's under, there was a question earlier, and we'll get into more of this later, of talking about when is it safe to fail and what does that look like? Like a lot of it has to do with how are you responding to what it is they're doing, right? Are you upset at them if they start to fall apart? Or are you like, well, that's what we'd expect to have happen. Now let's see if we can hold on to it a little longer and go more strokes before it starts to fall apart, right? So a lot of it has to do with your affect and how you respond to the moments of their failing. There's more that we'll get into later. All right, so training, understanding a couple of things about training that are super important. So at this stage, it's a good idea if they were doing multiple sports still, particularly if they're complementary. That would be the most appropriate long-term athlete development. We want to be building aerobic capacity. So just like Dr. Feeler was saying, a tremendous amount of steady state in that green zone. Building some speed and strength, depending a little bit on developmental age, is appropriate. So most appropriate would be 6 to 9 training sessions in the course of a week, and 3 to 6 of those are actually rowing on the water. ERG scores should really be about individual progress and not about competition. And right now, understand that the ERG scores are going to highly slant towards the early maturing athletes. And so what we really don't want is to be discouraging the kids that are going to be the future Olympic athletes, but aren't there yet. So And I can tell you, one of the powers of stories and being in a place for a long period of time, and is like, I had one kid when I was at CRI who, I think by the time she was a senior, had won maybe 5 gold medals at youth nationals. And I would have her go and talk to the novices all the time. And she would say, which was true, she would say all the time, I was the slowest kid on novice, which she was. She wasn't even all that fast as a sophomore. It took time. And as a junior and senior, she started to be in championship boats. But understanding the importance of being able to tell that story, not just for me, but for having her actually come and tell that story, even come back as an alum sometimes, makes it really important to understand that, like, if she had been in a circumstance where she had felt shamed and didn't want to even continue after having been the slowest novice, we would have missed out on a really successful future athlete. So some other considerations: skeletal muscles are still not going to be balanced for rowing. Usually that means that their backs are the weakest link. Their relatively low previous volume means it's relatively easy for you to create a training stimulus. So I think it's really important for you to be patient and understand that, like, you don't need to work them to death. You just need to work them enough to get a training stimulus so that their fitness will increase. And that really allows you to do some stuff like do some cross training, because that's going to enable them to keep developing aerobically, even though their backs are going to be basically a limiting factor. But it also means that you have a lot of time to spend on technique with these kids, because it's relatively easy to get enough of a training stimulus that's going to move them forward. And so what we don't need to do lets us develop the athlete more effectively for the long term. So we don't need to do a lot of rowing specific race endurance, like 2K speed stuff, because again, that's not what they're going to be optimally primed physiologically to respond to. Really only as their hormonal systems are more fully developed do you need to be, making that more primary. So shorter intervals, probably more appropriate to their attention span at this point still, also is really important. Aerobic training, teaching them to maintain focus, what novices could never do. So with novices, I like to do a little more interval work. This is the time with the second year rower where you're really starting to push their ability to sustain constant pieces a little bit longer. So I think with novices, it's a good idea, for example, to like change the stroke rate, change something in the piece every minute or two at the outset. So I'd never say, okay, we're going to go out and do it, even a 10-minute consistent piece at one stroke rate. With the second year rower, now you can start to see, okay, if you don't change the stimulus as often, how long can you get them to be consistent and focused on what's going on? And start to build that idea of being able to hold on to a rhythm in a way that the most inexperienced athletes are not able to do. But what you don't want to do is assume that they can do it. So you've got to build that as a skill. And sometimes that is literally something you're like, okay, we're going to go out, and it starts to fall apart and say, okay, way enough. Let's take a breath. Why did I stop you? It's starting to fall apart. Focus isn't there. People are not as together. Okay, we're going to finish the work, but let's see if we can bring it back in and get that focus back together, and then start up against it. And then, or maybe you say, like, okay, so I had to stop you after 2 minutes and 30 seconds. Let's see if we can go to 4 minutes before it starts to get hinky. Just moments like that. And again, you don't want to shame them and make them feel bad about it. It's got to be very value neutral. You're not trying to say this is a terrible thing. You're like, hey, we got to build our ability to sustain this focus. Let's see if we can do it longer. And so just idea of remembering that we're training attention as much as we are training the body. Games and competition, again, super effective. I really like leapfrog. I think kids have a lot of fun with leapfrog. I think, if you keep them in even boats and do leapfrog, that can be super fun. There's a tremendous amount they can learn from it. Strength training, just quickly. And again, I'm not a strength and conditioning coach, But just everything I understand, like we want to be focused on training form for movements. I think functional training has been really important. I've been lucky enough to be able to bring in outside expertise on strength and conditioning for most of the time. You don't need to be doing a lot of heavy lifting yet, but I do think there's a tremendous value in doing strength and conditioning work, assuming you're doing the right kind of stuff. And I think part of that is that a lot of the movement patterns that you can train in the weight room to a really high degree of specificity are going to actually help and relate to rowing technique. It's not exactly the same, but it can help to get them concepts. So, you know, if you can get them to learn how to do a kettlebell swing well, it actually can be really helpful for what you're then talking about in the boat sometimes, just as a one example. And I do think a lot of times when you have disordered movement patterns that were grained in by their novices, that of course were not your fault at all, that sometimes it's easier for them to isolate the muscles that are being used and understand the muscle movement pattern on land and then bring it to the boat. So one of the things that I always come back to is that the human body is always strongest when we move from big muscles to smaller muscles. And so when you have the athlete that is really used and ingrained to grabbing too early, you know, teaching them to get that idea that the shoulder leads the elbow when they're going to start to use the arm. Sometimes, you know, one session with a kettlebell or a dumbbell and then getting them to understand that on land can then lead to them making a technical change on the water. All right. We are rapidly approaching the end of our time. So I want to quickly go through some of the culture building and then get to some of the questions. So understand that human behavior is predicated on social context. We are all social beings. So proactively creating the culture you want is really, really important. You know, you can't let the culture be something that the athletes determine entirely by themselves. Building culture reinforces this. I always think culture is the engine of performance. So building culture reinforces the sense that the athlete belongs to something special. That motivational climate we talked about is a key part of that culture. And this sort of sophomore year is a really critical time for them to build their buy-in to team culture. In other words, as novices, it was all new, it was all about their friends. Now they're starting to be like, I'm part of this and this is what that means. And I'm really proud of being a member of this team. So athletes respond tremendously well to peer pressure, and team building exercises create an opportunity for you to influence that pressure. So one of the things I always do is this exercise called the qualities of an ideal teammate. And what amazes me is that I've been doing this for 20 plus years across all kinds of different teams, junior teams, camp teams, collegiate teams. I've never found a group of athletes that don't come up with really good ideas for this. Like if you were to sit down and think of like, what do you think are the ideals of an ideal teammate? If you do this kind of exercise, they will almost always match, and they maybe even come up with some better ways of thinking about it than I can, right? And in other words, when you put it in the context of them brainstorming about what those ideals are, they know what the right answers are, even if they don't actually act that way all the time now. But what's really powerful about this is that once they start to state the ideals, and what I do is sort of distill it down to no more than 10, usually 5 is better. Like, what are the things that we're going to really hold ourselves to? They come up with these ideals, but when they actually state them to each other, that is way more powerful, especially to this age group, than me as an authority figure telling them what they should be, right? So now, can you slip things in there? There's always the opportunity if there's something that they are missing, where you can sort of bring that up in conversation, or even with some teams where the coaches were not sure of this, I allowed the coaches to be their own separate group, and the group as a whole come to a consensus as to whether anything the coaches came up with was worth adding. But I've never found that to be actually necessary. That they have in their heads what those ideals really should be. But some of the other elements of team building, I really love the work that's been done by having people do ropes courses together. Doing community service stuff can be great. I think goal buddies are a really good idea. And I think that distributed leadership is really important. Like start coming out with leadership roles that are not just about the captains, but leaders within the team that you can do, particularly at this age group. They need to start exercising the leadership muscles as sophomores to be really good at it as seniors. This is probably a little bit out of order because we talked about some of this stuff already, but understanding the transformation of their motivational structures. Like the expectations of a varsity athlete are really quite high. And so as a sophomore, the athlete's going to be sitting there saying, can I actually do this? And is it worth it to put in the work? And so if we're going to get them to sort of get to the point where they're saying, yes, I want to do this and I want to put the time in and I want to definitely be a part of this, they need to really see the journey. And I think this is where bringing in the older kids and getting them to understand things like, well, what were the scores of these kids that are really fast now, or maybe around the junior national team when they were freshmen and sophomores? Because it just opens up this possibility of like, yes, actually, they're not space aliens. They're not some totally different kind of being. They actually are people like me, and that if I actually put the time in and develop, I will get to someplace. Because otherwise, right now, particularly coming off their novice year, a lot of times it just seems like, oh my God, I can't, I'll never be that good. As we are getting pretty close to the end of time, I do want to actually just sort of jump into some of the questions here instead of going on too much on the rest of the stuff, because I do think we have some really good questions. So looking at this idea of any advice on creating structured situations where implicit learning can be directed. I mean, you know, look, I think there's a tremendous amount of opportunity if you have access to things like small boats, where you're getting them to really just feel what they are doing. And I know that that's a big ask if you're sort of stuck with the things that you have and you don't have any access to small boats. But essentially what you're doing is with implicit learning is trying to get them to figure something out on their own. Okay, and you can do that in bigger boats too. It's just harder at the skill level because there's so much else going on. They kind of all have to come to the same moment of realization at the same time. But in terms of your creating structure for it is you get to set what the challenge is, right? So it doesn't really matter. You can do that in any number of different ways. But once you sort of set up the see if you can do X, Y, or Z, right? Then they need to solve the problem. It's this idea of them engaging with what's going on with their own rather than just doing what they're being told to do explicitly. So the implicit learning comes about when essentially they're solving the problem for themselves. This question, when coaching a small team where second-year rowers and sometimes novices are mixed with varsity athletes, how do you find a balance in the water training so that athletes on either side don't become frustrated? Not wanting the varsity athletes to feel like they're undertrained. Yeah, I mean, I think the really simple answer to this is that you've got to keep the water training to the level of the lowest common denominator and hard bake into the system the idea of individualized training and opportunities for that, whether it be on land or extra practices or any number of different ways of that. But fundamentally, and this is the same answer I would say if you're dealing with just really high level experienced athletes, it's still the same thing, which is that always have a land component which can then be individualized. So, if we talk about sort of how you train using like Jensen profile testing, right? So even with more experienced kids, I'm always doing that, where it's always a portion of the training is on the water and a portion of the training is going to be on land, so that that portion of the training can be targeted at where the individual is. And so when you're dealing with really highly different levels, you've got to do the exact same thing. Now, the good news here is that you can actually have even relatively newer rowers doing a lot of low intensity, and that's perfectly appropriate, especially if you listen to what Dr. Seeler was saying. You know, if most of the time you're doing stuff that's relatively in that green zone, like that's a pretty wide area for most of these athletes, and it'll work pretty well. Leapfrog game, just super quickly, you're having some number of boats. You can do it with 2. It's more fun with more. Relatively even speeds of the boats. And essentially what you're doing is you're saying, okay, one boat is going to pass, and you can vary stroke rate. You can do it with varied intensity. I would tend to do this for relatively long work, and so I want them working fairly hard the whole time and work off of changing stroke rates. You can also do it with like one boat is by 6s and the other boat is all 8. And that has a lot of value as well. Let's say you're an 8, and they go up and they come up, and then they have to move all the way ahead and cross over in front, and then the boat at the back of the line gets to go, right? And push themselves up till they're at the front. And this is a tremendously valuable exercise, because one of the things that they start to figure out if you do this enough is they figure out how to make the boat move well and efficiently when they're not trying to be the ones passing, just so that they can be not going for as long. And that is a tremendously valuable technical skill. There's some implicit learning going on there. We currently have a varsity and a novice program. If coaching allows, would you suggest a JV program as well? I would, and I think actually the thing that I did that worked the best was for a while when we had a big enough squad and enough coaches when I was at CRI, was that the kids coming out of their novice year would actually, the next year, they would generally be in kind of a sculling group. And the explicit goal that they had was to learn enough about how to scull that they could pass their captain's test, which would then allow them to row a single and train on their own, which is a really valuable for me to have varsity athletes who could, take a single out with moderate supervision and not direct supervision. And so it also did the great thing of setting up like their goal then, that right away they had this goal that was about mastery, which is like, can I actually pass my captain's test? And so that worked really, really well. I do think that, will you have athletes that sort of make the jump to being in the top boat? Yeah, probably. Every now and then you'll get a kid who's like just done a lot of other sports beforehand and is a really good fit kid and is going to make the 1V, and that's fine. How the varsity coach then deals with that athlete, we could have a whole conversation about that. But I think definitely paying attention to that group and setting it up a little bit differently and really pushing the idea of mastery and skill mastery and having this whole set of goals as to what they're doing beyond just like what's happening in terms of winning and losing races, tremendously valuable and important. So I think we've actually gone over, if I'm correct.
Yes. Yep,
yeah.
We are 4 minutes over.
Yeah, so apologies for that. I don't know if I got to all the questions. Sarah, did you want to, was there anything in particular that you wanted to highlight?
There are 2 quick questions that I think I could give you and you could rapid fire answer.
Sure.
Can you give a quick example situation of what a safe to fail scenario would be? Like, what is a good workout for a safe to fail?
And I touched on this before. Again, so much of this idea of creating an environment in which failure is acceptable is about how you talk about what's happening, right? And so it really is about creating that culture and the language with which, how are you addressing when things are going wrong technically in the boat? How are you addressing when people aren't meeting splits? And this idea of trying to get across, like, if you don't make it relatively, safe for them, and I say relatively because they're probably never going to be happy if they feel like they failed somehow. But if you don't create the circumstances where it's okay for them to fail, then they're not going to try and challenge themselves. And so one of the things that I always thought was really cool is that for a while, when US Rowing was doing this like mixed elite and everything else at Club National, so there are all these different levels, we actually a couple of times would put in a boat in the Elite Eight, because it was kind of at the end of the day, and we would have like the top couple of juniors and the top couple of masters, and they were so excited to do this. They were never going to win the race. They just wanted to be like, hey, can we hang with them for 500 meters? And the amount of like thrill that brought to them to say, hey, you know, can we actually do this? Super, super important. It was revealing of a fact that they were willing to try things where failure was inevitable. So again, so much of this has to do with how do you respond to their moments of failure? How do you contextualize it after the end of a practice? So one of the things to understand is just telling them like it's okay to not be perfect. Like we are not expecting perfection, right? Are you mad at them when they make a mistake? If they catch a crab, are you like, oh, you know, or are you like, okay, like, let's move on, let's figure this out, and then let's talk about, okay, why did that happen? What can we do to prevent it? So a lot of it has to do with the coach affect and the coach language, and also your tolerance of how their peers respond to those moments. So anyway.
Great, Ethan. Yeah, I mean, sadly, I know we could talk about this forever, but sadly we are 7 minutes over. But thank you. And thank you for everyone who joined us. And hopefully you get a little lunch break, Ethan and everyone else. And we'll see you all later this afternoon.
If I can just say one last thing, which is that if anybody has any questions, feel free to reach out. Super happy to continue the conversation at a later date, or send me an email or whatever it is, so that we can you know, get at any of these things that you want to know more about, or just want to talk about. Can't promise an answer in every case, but I can at least try and point you in the right direction. So.
Perfect. Well, thanks again, Ethan, and enjoy your afternoons, everyone.
Thank you.